Welcome back to Revise and Resubmit, and welcome to another weekend book review. I'm Pavlov.
And I'm Nikita.
You're here because you want to get smart fast on fascinating topics, and, well, you appreciate those aha moments where everything just clicks.
We definitely get that.
We're diving deep so you don't have to, bringing you the core insights without, all the overwhelm.
And today, we're tackling something pretty mind-bending, an alternative to how we usually think about reality. Analytic idealism.
Right, which is definitely a different beast from the view most of us absorb, which is physicalism.
Exactly. Physicalism, basically says reality at its core is just physical stuff. Matter, energy, things you can measure, and that's it. That's the foundation.
So the common idea is it's all about atoms and forces described by math.
Yeah.
But we've been looking at some really thought-provoking material, focusing today on Bernardo Kastrup's Analytic Idealism in a nutshell.
Yeah, it's a great summary. It really distills the main arguments from his much larger body of work into something more accessible.
And our mission here is to explore this view, maybe scratch that itch you might have. Is there actually more to reality than just the physical?
Precisely. And maybe a good starting point, something Kastrup himself raises, is this. Think about all our technology. We've landed on the moon. We manipulate genes. Amazing stuff.
Incredible achievements, yeah.
So how plausible is it that, despite all that, our most basic idea about what reality is could still be fundamentally wrong?
That's a powerful question to start with.
Yeah.
Okay, let's jump into a core concept. Kastrup uses this dashboard analogy. It's meant to really shift how we think about perception.
Yeah, this one's key. The idea is that what we experience isn't, a direct window onto reality. It's much more like, well, think about the dashboard in an airplane cockpit.
Okay, got it. Dials, lights, readout.
Right. It shows the pilot vital information, speed, altitude, fuel, direction, stuff they absolutely need to fly the plane safely.
Absolutely essential. But crucially, that dashboard looks nothing like the actual sky outside, does it?
Not at all. It's instruments and symbols. It doesn't need to look like clouds or the horizon to convey accurate, relevant information about them.
Okay, I see where this is going.
So apply that to us. Our senses, sight, hearing, touch, taste, smell, they're like the plane sensors. They gather data.
And what we actually experience, the colors, the sounds, the feelings, that's our personal dashboard. It's how our brain presents that data to us, encoded.
Exactly. So the world as it is in itself could be radically different from how we perceive it, just like the sky is different from the dials. Our perception gives us what we need to navigate, but it's not a mirror image. What we see isn't necessarily what we get.
It really resonates with work by people like Carl Friston, right? The idea of perception managing complexity.
Yes, precisely. Friston talks about limiting the entropy, the potential chaos of our internal states. A dashboard simplifies vast amounts of data into useful indicators. Our perception probably does something similar, encoding reality efficiently, so we're not overwhelmed, so we can, survive and function.
So we're kind of like pilots who've only ever seen the inside of a windowless cockpit. We just see the instruments.
And we've ended up thinking the instruments are the sky. That's the core of the analogy. We've never directly known anything but this perceptual dashboard.
In all our language, our concepts, they describe the dashboard.
Right. So we naturally assume the physical world we see and touch is reality as it fundamentally is.
Which brings us back to the technology point. Our success there doesn't prove our fundamental view is right.
Exactly. It's like being a world champion gamer without knowing anything about silicon chips or programming languages.
You just need to master the game's interface, the convenient fiction on the screen.
Precisely. Newtonian physics got us to the moon, even though it's not the final word on gravity. It was empirically convenient. Our tech proves we can manipulate the dashboard really well, not that we understand the ultimate reality behind it.
And historically, past generations were always wrong about the fundamental nature of reality, weren't they?
That's a key point Kastrup makes. Why should we assume we're the first generation to get it perfectly right? Maybe physicalism is just our generation's convenient fiction.
Okay, so if physicalism might be this convenient fiction, how did it become so dominant, especially during the Enlightenment?
Well, Kastrup suggests it wasn't purely a scientific conclusion. There were historical, even sociopolitical reasons. Think about the context.
The church was still a major power.
Exactly. So, distinguishing a separate physical realm from the psyche, or spirit, well, that created a kind of safe space for science. Scientists could study the physical world without immediately stepping on the church's toes regarding the soul or mind.
Ah, so it was partly strategic, a way to carve out intellectual territory.
Sort of, yeah. At least initially, it was maybe more of a practical approach, a psychological handle, as Kastrup puts it. Focus on what you can measure and test without getting into thorny theological debates.
But then it seems like this useful separation kind of solidified, became an assumption about reality itself.
That's the argument. And then this rather strange thing happened, what Kastrup calls a surreal feat of circular reasoning. Physicalism, now gaining ground, started using its own assumptions to basically downplay the one thing we know directly: our own conscious experience, phenomenal consciousness.
The feeling of being here, experiencing things, which is like the starting point for everything, right? You need consciousness to even do science.
Precisely. It's the only thing we know pre-theoretically. Yet physicalism increasingly treated it as secondary, an epiphenomenon.
Meaning just a side effect, like steam from a train engine, having no real effect itself.
Exactly. A byproduct of brain activity with no real causal power. And if it's just a powerless byproduct, well, you don't need to spend too much time trying to explain it, do you? It conveniently pushes the hardest problem off the table.
That does sound convenient for simplifying the scientific picture.
It did for a while, but thankfully things started to shift. Thomas Nagel's famous 1974 paper, What Is It Like to Be a Bat?, was a real turning point in bringing consciousness back to the forefront.
Asking that fundamental question about subjective experience.
Right, so analytic idealism, in this context, presents itself as a way to correct these, let's say, historical and philosophical missteps, taking consciousness seriously from the start.
Okay, so physicalism has this history and this deep problem with consciousness. What about challenges coming directly from science itself? You mentioned quantum physics earlier.
Yes, quantum mechanics throws up some major roadblocks for standard physicalism, especially entanglement experiments, the work that won the 2022 Nobel Prize in Physics, in fact.
Entanglement. That's the spooky action at a distance, where particles stay connected even when far apart.
That's the one. Basically, you create two particles linked in a special quantum state, send them off in different directions, and then measure a property of each one. Let's say Alice measures hers and Bob measures his.
And the weird part is?
The really baffling part is that the choice Alice makes about what to measure on her particle instantly seems to determine the possible outcomes for Bob's measurement, no matter how far apart they are.
Instantly. Faster than light.
It appears that way, which really challenges the idea that these particles have definite, independent properties just sitting there before you measure them. The experiment strongly suggests that physicality, the properties we measure, somehow emerges from the act of measurement.
Wow. Okay, so reality isn't definite until we look. That directly contradicts the idea of an objective physical world just existing out there on its own.
It certainly seems to. Which forces physicalists into some, let's say, quite elaborate explanations to try and save their view.
Like what? How do they try to square this circle?
Well, one major attempt is the many worlds interpretation, often linked with Everett.
Ah, the parallel universes idea. Every measurement splits the universe.
That's the gist. Every time a quantum measurement could have multiple outcomes, the universe branches, and each outcome happens in its own separate universe. So Alice gets result A in one universe, result B in another, and the correlations hold within each branch.
That sounds incredibly extravagant. And how would you even test for infinite parallel universes?
Exactly. Kastrup calls it wildly inflationary and fundamentally untestable. It's pure speculation designed to preserve realism.
Okay, what's the alternative physicalist escape route?
The other main one is superdeterminism. This idea posits that there are some kind of hidden variables we don't know about.
Hidden variables?
Yeah, and these variables supposedly predetermine everything from the Big Bang onwards, including Alice's choice of measurement and Bob's choice and the particle states in just the right way to produce the correlations we see without any faster-than-light influence needed.
So everything is predetermined, including the experimenter's choices. That sounds... well, it gets rid of free will, for one thing.
It does, and it's incredibly vague. What are these hidden variables? How do they work? Superdeterminism doesn't offer specific testable mechanisms. It's more like saying there must be some explanation within physicalism, even if we can't imagine it.
So Kastrup sees both many worlds and superdeterminism as kind of ad hoc fantasies, just trying to rescue the physicalist assumption.
Pretty much, he uses an analogy. Imagine claiming that the settings on your camera actually change the moon itself when you photograph it. That way, whatever your photo shows, you never have to question your existing beliefs about the moon. Superdeterminism is a bit like that, saying the measurement settings were somehow pre-coordinated with the particles.
That does sound quite contrived. And the Nobel Prize confirms the experimental results are solid.
Absolutely. The data is consistent and robust. This isn't fringe science.
So how does analytic idealism handle this? If it's not many worlds or superdeterminism.
Well, think back to the dashboard. Imagine two different TV screens showing the same live football game, maybe from different camera angles.
Okay.
The action on both screens is perfectly correlated, right? A goal on one is a goal on the other simultaneously. But the TVs aren't directly influencing each other.
Right, they're both just showing the same underlying event, the game.
Exactly. Analytic idealism suggests something similar for entanglement. The particles aren't independent things sending spooky signals. They are different manifestations or representations, like different camera views, of the same underlying non-physical, in this view, mental reality.
So their correlation isn't action at a distance, it's because they're aspects of the same underlying thing, just observed differently.
Precisely. The measurement by Alice and Bob are just different ways of accessing or making manifest aspects of that shared underlying reality. It avoids faster than light signaling, infinite universes, and untestable hidden variables by changing the fundamental assumption about what the particles are.
That actually sounds much more intuitive in a way.
Yeah.
Okay, quantum mechanics is one area. What about neuroscience? The brain.
Yes, the brain and consciousness present their own set of challenges for physicalism. Take psychedelic experiences, for instance.
Okay, like psilocybin or LSD.
Right. Now, from a simple physicalist standpoint, if the brain creates consciousness, you might expect that a much richer, more intense conscious experience would correlate with more brain activity, wouldn't you? A busier factory produces more output.
Yeah, that seems like the logical prediction. More experience, more brain firing.
But the evidence often points the other way. Studies using fMRI and other techniques frequently show an overall decrease in brain activity, or at least changes in connectivity, during profound psychedelic states.
The decrease. While the person is having this incredibly vivid, expanded experience, that seems paradoxical.
It does. So physicalists have had to come up with explanations. One prominent idea Kastrup discusses is the entropic brain hypothesis.
Entropic, meaning more random, more disordered.
Yes, the idea is that psychedelics increase the brain's entropy, essentially making brain activity more random or noisy, less predictable, and somehow this increased randomness is or causes the psychedelic experience.
Wait, so more randomness equals more complex, meaningful experience. That feels counterintuitive, like saying adding static to a radio makes the music richer.
You've hit on one of Kastrup's main criticisms. He points out a crucial confusion between Shannon information, which is really about unpredictability or compressibility, like static and semantic information, which is about meaning. Random noise has high Shannon entropy, but no meaning.
Right. Static doesn't spontaneously become a symphony just because it's random. Equating brain noise with, say, mystical insights seems like a leap.
A huge leap. Plus, Kastrup notes, even proponents don't really argue that the noise is the consciousness. And it implies psychedelic consciousness works via a totally different mechanism than normal consciousness, which seems overly complicated, needing two different explanations.
And is the measured increase in noise even significant?
Apparently not. He cites studies showing incredibly tiny increases in this randomness metric, like fractions of a percent, it seems.
Yeah.
Well, ludicrous to suggest such a minuscule change causes such a profound subjective transformation.
And sometimes the noise even decreased.
Yes, there are cases reported where measured brain entropy went down while the psychedelic effects were happening. It really challenges the neat correlation.
So the entropic brain idea seems shaky. How does analytic idealism look at this?
Well, if the brain isn't the producer of consciousness, but rather its image or representation, how consciousness looks from the outside,
then a change in brain activity doesn't necessarily mean consciousness is being produced, more or less. It just means the image is changing.
Exactly. A decrease in certain kinds of activity could reflect maybe a lessening of the normal filters or constraints on consciousness. Perhaps the dissociative boundaries that keep our individual awareness contained become more permeable.
So less filtering could lead to a wider, richer experience, even if the measurable brain activity associated with that filtering goes down.
That's a possible interpretation within analytic idealism. The brain becomes more like a receiver or a reducing valve, and psychedelics might temporarily adjust that valve.
That completely flips the script from the brain as generator model.
It does.
Yeah.
And it leads us right back to that fundamental issue for physicalism.
The hard problem of consciousness.
The hard problem. How do you get subjective quality? The redness of red, the feeling of sadness from purely objective quantity, neuron firing rates, chemical concentrations.
There just seems to be no logical bridge.
Yeah.
You can describe the physics of light hitting my eye and the neurons firing all the way back, but nothing in that description is the experience of seeing red.
Precisely. Kastrup uses the map and territory metaphor here. Physical quantities, scientific measurements, that's the map. Our actual conscious experience, the taste of chocolate, the feeling of love, that's the territory.
And physicalism tries to say the map somehow creates the territory.
Or that the territory is nothing but the map.
Right.
But the map only has meaning because it refers to the territory.
Yeah.
Trying to derive the territory solely from the map is like trying to taste the word chocolate on the page. It misses the whole point, the actual experience.
So it's not just that we don't know how the brain makes consciousness yet. It's that it seems conceptually impossible within a purely physical framework, a fundamental mismatch.
That's the argument. It's an epistemic contradiction, not just a gap in current knowledge.
Okay, so we've seen the challenges physicalism faces with quantum mechanics, neuroscience, and the hard problem. Let's crystallize the alternative. Analytic idealism itself, in a nutshell.
In a nutshell, reality is fundamentally mental. It's experiential at its core.
That sounds simple, but also radical. What's the reasoning?
The reasoning starts from the only thing we know for sure directly, our own consciousness. Thoughts, feelings, perceptions, sensations, it's all experience. Anything we ever access, observe, or even theorize about, we access through experience.
So all evidence, all data ultimately comes to us as experience.
Right. So the claim is, the most parsimonious assumption is that the nature of reality is the same as the nature of the only thing we have direct access to, which is experience or mentality.
But hang on, there's obviously a world outside my individual mind. I didn't create this room, this microphone.
Absolutely. Analytic idealism fully acknowledges an external world that exists independently of your personal mind, or mine. That's crucial.
So how does it account for that external world if everything is mental?
The inference is this. Since all we know directly is mentality, the most reasonable conclusion is that the external world is also mental in nature. It consists of transpersonal mental processes, experiences happening outside the boundary of your individual psyche.
Transpersonal, like a wider field of mentation.
Something like that. Think of it perhaps as a universal field of subjectivity. And what we perceive as the physical world, tables, chairs, stars, atoms, that's the appearance of these transpersonal mental states.
The appearance, how does that work?
It's the dashboard again. The physical world is what those underlying mental states look like when observed from a particular dissociated viewpoint, namely ours. Our senses and brain structure, how we perceive this underlying mentation, presenting it to us as seemingly objective matter and energy.
So matter isn't the fundamental stuff. Matter is the representation of underlying mental processes as seen from the outside.
That's the core idea. Matter is what mentality looks like across a dissociative boundary.
And these boundaries are what create individual minds like ours within this larger mind space.
Yes. If reality is fundamentally a field of experience, then individual conscious agents like us must be demarcated by some kind of boundary within that field. Kastrup talks about these as dissociative boundaries in consciousness, similar perhaps to how alters form in dissociative identity disorder.
Okay, DID. Dissociative identity disorder, you mentioned that as potential supporting evidence. How so?
Well, consider DD. You have one human body, one brain, but it hosts multiple distinct centers of consciousness, alters each with their own personality, memories, and sense of self.
Right, multiple personalities.
And crucially, these alters can be co-conscious. They can be aware simultaneously, sometimes even interact within shared internal experiences, like dreams. Kastrup cites examples where alters report being in the same dream, seeing it from their own perspective, interacting with each other consistently.
Wow. So multiple viewpoints within one mind, experiencing a shared internal reality.
Exactly. It serves as a kind of existence proof that multiple bounded fields of subjectivity can coexist within a single, broader mental system. It's an analogy for how we might be dissociated segments of a larger universal consciousness, experiencing our shared physical world, which is actually the extrinsic appearance of that larger consciousness.
That's a fascinating, if challenging, analogy. What other phenomena does analytic idealism point to?
Well, think back to those disconnects between brain activity and experience we talked about. Psychedelics, near-death experiences, maybe even sudden savant syndrome where abilities emerge after brain injury.
Cases where the physical brain state doesn't seem to neatly predict the subjective experience.
Right. From an analytic idealist perspective, these could potentially be instances where the usual dissociative boundaries of our individual consciousness become temporarily weaker or more permeable.
Allowing access to what? More of the underlying mental reality.
Perhaps access to information or modes of experience not usually available, not typically represented by our normal dashboard of brain activity. Again, the brain is the image, not the source. So a change in experience doesn't have to mean more or less production by the brain. It could mean a change in what's being accessed or filtered.
Like tuning into a different frequency almost.
That's one way to think about it. And one more intriguing point Kastrup sometimes raises, the structural similarities between the cosmic web, the large-scale structure of galaxy filaments in the universe, and neural networks in the brain.
You mean they look similar topologically?
Surprisingly so, yes.
Yeah.
From an information theory perspective, the patterns of connection and clustering show remarkable parallels, despite the vastly different scales and physical constituents.
Why would a physicalist expect the universe's structure to resemble a brain structure?
It's hard to see why they would, beyond coincidence. But if the universe is fundamentally mental, then perhaps the large-scale structure is simply the extrinsic appearance, the outside view, of the complex inner organization of cosmic mentation, just as a brain scan is the outside view of our inner mental organization. The same underlying principles of mental organization might manifest similarly at different scales.
So it hints at a unified underlying principle that analytic idealism might accommodate more naturally.
Potentially, yes. It's suggestive rather than a definitive proof, of course.
Okay, so wrapping this up, the core idea of analytic idealism is that nature is fundamentally one vast, interconnected field of experience of subjectivity.
Yes, spatially unbound consciousness.
And our physical world, the one we interact with, is essentially our perception, our dashboard representation of what's going on within that underlying mental reality.
That's it. And the argument is that this view, while maybe initially counterintuitive, actually offers more coherent, more parsimonious explanations for some really tough problems that physicalism struggles badly with.
Like consciousness itself, the quantum measurement problem, those weird brain activity disconnects.
Exactly. It attempts to solve them by starting from a different fundamental premise.
It definitely forces a rethink of, well, everything. Our place in the universe, the nature of life and death. If consciousness is fundamental, then maybe the end of the body isn't the end of awareness.
That's a profound implication many find compelling, the idea that individuality might be temporary dissociation, not the fundamental state, and the notion that the universe might be experiencing itself through us. That gives existence a very different flavor.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You mentioned one final idea, something about space-time.
Right. There's growing thought in physics that space-time might not be fundamental, but rather emergent from something deeper, maybe quantum information or entanglement.
Right.
Analytic idealism offers a potential metaphysical grounding for this. If reality is fundamentally mental, then maybe space-time and the laws of physics aren't irreducible structures, but rather represent the way information is structured and related within that primary consciousness, like semantic or cognitive associations, the rules of the universal mind's thoughts, manifesting to us as space, time, and physical law.
So the very fabric of reality could be more like grammar or logic within a mind, rather than a physical stage.
That's the kind of truly radical implication being explored. It challenges our deepest intuitions about a solid extended world being the bedrock of reality.
Wow. This has been, a genuinely mind-expanding deep dive. Analytic idealism clearly isn't just a minor tweak to physicalism. It's a fundamentally different way of looking at existence.
It really is. It offers a coherent alternative, even if it raises its own questions.
Definitely food for thought. It's a powerful reminder that maybe, just maybe, our current mainstream view isn't the final story. Thanks so much for unpacking this with us.
My pleasure. It's fascinating stuff.
And for everyone listening, remember, this is just scratching the surface. If this sparked your curiosity, there's much more to explore about analytic idealism, its evidence, its implications.
Absolutely. Engaging with these ideas, questioning assumptions, that's how our understanding evolves. You're part of that process just by listening and thinking about it.
And don't forget to subscribe to Revise and Resubmit on Spotify and Apple Podcasts for more captivating deep dives like this one. And if you're enjoying the show, and want to support us in creating more insightful content, consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Every contribution helps us continue this journey of exploration and discovery. Until next time, keep those minds curious, keep questioning, and keep revising and resubmitting.